Welcome to episode 4, and today we're going to go through cerebral blood flow autoregulation and the breakdown of the short answer question from 2019. We're just going to review the examiner's report, do a literature review, and then create an answer structure and write an answer to time. So the August-September 2019 question 2 paper states, describe the normal regulation of cerebral blood flow and outline physiological factors which may alter it. And in bold capital letters, do not discuss the effects of medications or pathology. When we look at the examiner's report, the major domains assessed in this question were, so they wanted the normal values for cerebral blood flow and the importance of the consistency of supply. And then they wanted you to talk about the local autoregulatory mechanisms, which there are multiple forms. And then after that, the physiological factors altering flow. And that's to do with the formula cerebral blood flow equals cerebral perfusion pressure divided by cerebral vascular resistance. Okay, that's what this is related to. Credit was given for other correct relevant material. Notably, this question focused on normal regulation and physiology. And just highlighted in red, specifically asked candidates not to discuss medications or pathology. Candidates who digressed into factors which impact intracranial pressure were commonly not able to explore the breadth and depth of the other material considered central to this question. And you can see why this would be a rabbit's hole, because intracranial pressure is related to your cerebral perfusion pressure. And that I think that a lot of candidates would actually start discussing about the Monroe-Kelly doctrine and factors that affect intracranial pressure, which subsequently would affect your cerebral perfusion pressure and your cerebral blood flow. But as we sort of go through this question, this is not what this question is asking for, okay? So the other thing with the examiner's report, and this is just a summary, is that it doesn't actually give you a good structure to how to approach this question. This examiner's report just really talks about what they would like to actually have in the content, but not the set out, not the structure of how it would like to be discussed. And that's important to know, is that not all examiner's reports are going to be that detailed. And this is probably one of the briefer ones. So to pass, you need to have normal values of cerebral blood flow. And then after that, also acknowledge the importance of consistency of supply, okay, or why there's autoregulation. And then after that, to discuss the autoregulatory mechanisms and tie it in with the physiological factors altering flow, where flow equals pressure divided by resistance. A good pass or extra marks would relate to relevant details related to regulation and physiology, and not medications or pathology. So just doing the literature review, very simple. The keywords that I used was just cerebral blood flow, and the 3 textbooks that I used. And as I sort of discussed in the Patreon, the Power and Cam chapter, it's actually quite easy to read. It's about 2 pages, and it gives you a really solid foundation in terms of what to build on. It's not enough to be comprehensive, but it is good enough to actually give you sort of good coverage in terms of what needs to be discussed. It probably covers about 75%, I think. Now, the other ones that I used were Pharmacology and Physiology by Hemmings and Egan and Miller's Anaesthesia. And what I noted was that the chapters were written by exactly the same authors, but in different order. So it's a little bit different, but it reads almost identical. And the nice thing about Hemmings and Egan is that the diagrams are a lot more concise. But Miller's is actually a lot more, it just has that layer of detail that I think just helps with a bit more understanding. So I'll summarize Power and Cam, and then what I'll do is I'll summarize Hemmings and Egan and Miller's Anaesthesia together, okay? Because a lot of what they've written is almost identical. Now, this is a summary of Power and Cam chapter 6. So cerebral blood flow is 750 mils per minute, or 15% of cardiac output. Now, it's important to know what it is in terms of grams per minute. So 50 mils per 100 grams per minute. And this is an important number to remember because this is an MCQ question. Okay, so they will, one of the MCQ questions asked you to identify which of the following values is cerebral blood flow. And I think it's actually good practice to talk about it in terms of mils per grams per minute rather than a total value, because that total value assumes a certain weight, and most often that weight is 70 kilograms, okay, in a 70 kilogram man. Now, the other formula, which I mentioned before, was that cerebral blood flow equals cerebral perfusion pressure divided by cerebrovascular resistance. And then the thing to note is that there is a proportional relationship between cerebral blood flow and cerebral metabolic rate. When Power and Cam talks about autoregulation and the myogenic response, that's not related to cerebral metabolic rate, okay? That's related to perfusion pressure. Just to summarize, these are sort of three concepts to know. This is separate, okay? This bit about autoregulation talks about the myogenic response to perfusion pressure, or the Baylis effect. And this is where it gets confusing, because a lot of texts that talk about autoregulation actually traditionally refer to the myogenic response. And this is why it can get a little bit confusing to know that there's actually other autoregulatory mechanisms involved. And then we'll go through Miller's, which actually delves into sort of a conventional way of thinking about autoregulation. But traditionally, when we think about autoregulation, or when it's been described previously in textbooks, it's solely referring to the myogenic response to perfusion pressure, or the Baylis effect, where cerebral blood flow is kept constant over a map of 50 to 150 millimeters of mercury. Now, note this number here, 50 to 150, okay? This is different to what Miller's and Hemmings and Egan will have in their texts, a little bit different. The other thing is that Power and Cam says nitric oxide is unlikely to involve, and the reason why I put that in is because when we go through the summary of Miller's and Hemmings and Egan, they all say that nitric oxide is likely to be involved. So you can see that there's a little bit of contradiction between the two sort of texts. So just be aware of that. This is the nice simple graph that you need to know for pressure autoregulation of the cerebral blood flow, or the Baylis effect. So the way that I would draw the graph is I would have the map on the x-axis, cerebral blood flow in mils per 100 grams per minute. I wouldn't have 20, 40, 60. I would actually have 50 here. Okay, so I would have 50 and I have 100, and 50 would prompt me to know that that's normal. And then if you want to follow Power and Cam, you have 50 to 150. All right, but what we'll do is we'll go through the numbers for Miller's, which is a little bit different, which is actually 70 and 150. But when I sort of draw these diagrams, I always have the important numbers on the x-axis. So you'll see it when I do my 10-minute answer, when I draw the diagrams, as in I'll label the axes with the important numbers. Now, the other thing to note about cerebral blood flow, so we've talked about pressure autoregulation, or the myogenic response. Now we're going to talk about the effect of CO2. So cerebral blood flow changes by 2 to 4% for every millimeter of mercury of partial pressure of CO2 between 20 to 80 millimeters of mercury. And then the way that it works is that CO2 diffuses rapidly across the blood-brain barrier, increases the concentration of extracellular hydrogen ions, and that causes vasodilatation or vasodilation. So it's actually through the effect of pH that causes vasodilation and the increase in cerebral blood flow. Now, the important thing to note is that hypotension will abolish this ability. The way that I would draw it would be that I would have 50 as my starting point and 100 on the y-axis. On the x-axis, I would have 20 to 80 as a point. And then what I would do is the midpoint here would be about sort of 40 to 50. Okay, this is where I know the normal point is, and then I'll draw the diagram from there. So those would be the four or 5 points that I would have in labeling this diagram. The ischemic parts of the brain do not respond to PaCO2, and that's important to know. And that's why there's concern about patients who have recently had an ischemic stroke, that they don't have that autoregulation that they normally would have. All right, and then the worry is that cerebral steal occurs when there is hypercarbia-induced vasodilatation in non-ischemic areas. So what happens is that if your CO2 was to rise, you would get vasodilation, but because the ischemic areas do not respond to CO2, the normal areas will vasodilate and theoretically can cause what cerebral steal, taking more blood away from the ischemic areas. Okay, and then the reverse can happen. So that's what's called the inverse steal or Robin Hood phenomenon, when there is hypocarbia and you get vasoconstriction of the normal areas, and then you get that diverted into the ischemic areas. Now, PowerCam doesn't actually talk about this, but the response to CO2 is not permanent. So it's rapid, but it is temporary, and it's said to last about 8 hours. So Miller's will talk about a different phenomenon, all right, with what happens after these 8 hours. So PowerCam is talking about what's happening within this 8 hours. And then after that, we'll go through what Miller's talks about in their chapter with regards to this phenomenon. The third thing that we need to know about autoregulation, as in a contemporary view of autoregulation in the cerebral blood flow, is the effect of oxygen. So cerebral blood flow increases when the partial pressure of oxygen falls to 50 millimeters of mercury, and it's set to double at 30 millimeters of mercury. Okay. And the way it does that is that tissue hypoxia and lactic acidosis are the reasons why that causes a vasodilation. This graph here, again, 50 would be your important point on your y-axis, so 50 to 100. And the numbers here are a little bit different from Miller's. Miller's will say less than 60 millimeters of mercury. Personally, I do prefer the numbers from Miller's because less than 60 would represent hypoxemia. And for me, that's just an easy number just to have that consistency that when hypoxemia occurs, that's when cerebral blood flow starts increasing. But for all intents and purposes, if you want to use PowerCam, the examiners will have a leeway with the numbers that you produce, and having 50 there would also be correct. Okay. And the reason why you would use 50 is because there is consistency in terms of or simplicity with that approach, because as you might have noted, 50 is also the map which your cerebral blood flow starts to drop off, and that's a number that PowerCam also has in their text as well. Okay. Now, the fourth thing with this is what's called metabolic coupling. So metabolic coupling, as I sort of previously mentioned, there is a direct relationship between cerebral blood flow and your cerebral metabolic rate. And what has been shown is that your cerebral metabolic rate changes by, this is from PowerCam, 7 to 10% for every degree Celsius change. The question that I had was that if your cerebral metabolic rate changes by 7 to 10% for every degree Celsius, does your cerebral blood flow also change by 7 to 10% for every degree Celsius? In other words, is it a one-to-one change? And that is something that it wasn't in the text, and I couldn't find it in any other textbooks, but I think from reading like a lot of the graphs, it's close to a one-to-one change. Okay, so I think you'll see some answers that you'll get as in template answers, which instead of putting CMR changes by 7 to 10%, they'll actually put cerebral blood flow changes by 7 to 10%. All right, so just be aware of that. But I think that the change is close to 1-to-1. Now, the fifth thing that's mentioned, it's what's called neurogenic control, and that's not well understood. Now, lastly, cerebral function is dependent on oxidative phosphorylation. And this next couple of statements will go back to why it's important to have autoregulation. All right. So the brain represents 2% of body weight, but 15 to 20% of oxygen consumption, which is 3 to 5 mils per minute per 100 grams. Again, looking at these numbers, if you were to actually work it out, 3 to 5 mils per 100 grams per minute, if you think about the brain, which is about, in a 70-kilogram man, is about 1.4 kilos. So in other words, that if you were to multiply this and work it out, what the true oxygen consumption of the brain is at 3 mils and at 5 mils, the numbers that you would get at 3 would be 42 mils, and at 5 would be 70. Okay, that's the total amount of oxygen consumption in the brain, assuming that the brain is 1.4 kilos. In other words, all I've done is 3 times 14 is 42, and 5 times 14 is 70. When we think about total oxygen consumption in the body, it's approximately about 250 mils per minute, okay? And then if you divide 42 by 250, you get approximately 17%. But if you divide 70 by 250, you get 28%. And that's why I don't really like the maths here, okay? This is, I'll accept this is correct, 15 to 20%, but the 3 to 5 mils just sounds a bit excessive. The 3 to 4 mils is probably more correct than 3 to 5 mils. Now, what's the oxygen consumption used for? So it's used for synaptic transmission, used for ion channels, and used for the life cycle of neurotransmitters. So life cycle of neurotransmitters includes its production, its breakdown, and its uptake and its recycling, okay? Now, the other important thing is that there is no storage of substrates, and there is a high metabolic rate, which explains its sensitivity to hypoxia or hypoxemia, which also explains why there is very, very tight control. Now, we're going to start summarizing Miller's and Hemmings and Egan. And with this, it will sort of build upon what we sort of talked about in Power and Cam. So the adult brain is 1.35 kilos or 2% of total body weight, but receives 15% of cardiac output. It reflects a high metabolic demand, and oxygen consumption here is 3.5 mils per 100 grams per minute, or 50 mils per minute, or 20% of oxygen consumption. And I much prefer these numbers than the one that Power and Cam has said. Now, I want you to just look at these numbers here. Oxygen consumption is 3.5 mils per 100 grams, sorry, and that's per minute, or a total of 50 mils per minute. Now that's oxygen consumption. But we also know that cerebral blood flow equals 50 mils per 100 grams per minute, okay? So just be aware of that there's symmetry of numbers here. But when we talk about oxygen consumption, if you want to use 50, that's your total. So that's 50 mils per minute in a 70 kilogram person, all right? Otherwise, the one that I would use is CMR02 equals 3.5 mils per 100 grams per minute. And those would be the two numbers that I would use. I'd use this, and I would use this. Okay. And so 60% of that oxygen consumption is functional or activity-based, and 40% is done for sort of basal homeostatic needs, okay? And that's temperature dependent. And the reason why there's tight control is that there's limited storage and a high metabolic rate. And then the other thing is that there's space constraints by a non-compliant cranium. So there's tight control because of limited storage and high metabolic rate to avoid a low cerebral blood flow. And there's also space constraints by a non-compliant cranium. So you want to avoid a high cerebral blood flow. Now, this table from Miller's, the values are quite sort of similar. When we talk about cerebral blood flow, it's approximately 50 mils per 100 grams per minute, but he's got a range of 45 to 55. And most of it will go to the gray matter, and less of it will head off to the white matter. Okay. These are some other values here. I think it's important just to be aware of them. Okay. And not so much that I think that they'll come up in a short answer question or that you need to reproduce it in a short answer question, but I think that, there may be an MCQ questions related to some of these numbers. Now, the other thing I want to sort of point you up to is this number here. So ICP. So in this box here, which is from Miller's, they've said that ICP is 8 to 12 millimeters of mercury. If you look at Power and CAM, I believe they have 5 to 15. And again, they have it, and that's in the supine position. And even in Hemmings and Egan, they've got it something different. They've got it 10 to 15. Okay, so you can even see that even within the same authors, they've got different values of what the intracranial pressure in the supine position is. Now, this slide here describes what the consumption of oxygen is going to. So this is your functional, which represents 60% of your cerebral metabolic rate consumption, and then basal homeostasis, which is all about sort of transport of nutrients and removal of waste products. Okay, and the electrophysiological function is similar to what Power and Cam talked about. So ion channels, maintenance of the ionic gradients, and synaptic transmission, and also to do with the recycling of, or the life cycle of neurotransmitters. So that's all to do with the electrophysiological function. And then the basal homeostasis, it's all about sort of removal of waste, delivery of metabolic substrates. Okay. Now, this table is from Hemmings and Egan, and I really like this table. So this table really sets out what we discussed in Power and Cam and actually gives us a framework of how we're going to answer this question. In other words, there's really 4 key things, 2, 3, 4. So chemical, myogenic, rheological, and neurogenic. And the big components are going to be your first 2, and that's all discussed in Power and Cam. Okay, so with chemical, the things that you need to add on are cerebral metabolic rate, the changes in arterial CO2, the changes in arterial oxygen, in the partial pressure of oxygen. And this is what I talk about sort of traditionally when we talk about cerebral autoregulation, we're talking about myogenic autoregulation. Okay, just be aware of that. But contemporarily, a lot of people, when they talk about autoregulation, will talk about all of this, like all this whole bit is considered autoregulation. But the reason why it's confusing is that most textbooks, when they talk about autoregulation, would just mean this. Okay. Now, the other things that Miller sort of talks about is going to be rheology, which has to do with blood viscosity, and neurogenic, which Power and Cam just sort of mentions briefly, and talks about the sympathetic and parasympathetic pathways. All right. Now, this graph here summarizes what you need to sort of draw for this answer. So you can either draw it on the same axes, and then what I think will be good is I would probably draw it. I would probably draw the PaO2 and PaCO2 on the same axes, and I would draw the map on a different axis. But I think it is important to know how to sort of draw it all on the same axes. And you can see that to do it, you can actually have the same sort of numbers anywhere. So your pressures can be 50 to 200. Again, 50 to 100 would be the numbers that I would use on the y-axis. And for MAP, what you do is you have the numbers where the autoregulation range is in. So in millers, which we'll go through, is 70 to 150. So I have those numbers there. And then after that, I would have the numbers, which is this point here, as around 50. Okay. We're going to start off with the first factor that affects the chemical side of things with cerebral blood flow. And that has to do with neuronal activity, which increases your cerebral metabolic rate, and hydrogen ions, potassium, calcium, lactate, adenosine and ATP, and nitric oxide. And you can see that, I don't know whether you remember from last week, but adenosine and ATP. So adenosine and ATP, you know, they've got multiple effects. So in this example here, adenosine and ATP are going to be vasodilating the vessels. Whereas remember that in when we talk about tubuloglomerular feedback, and we talk about the effect of adenosine and ATP on those purogenic or those G protein receptors, they actually, in the macula densa, they actually cause arterial vasoconstriction. Okay, so this is why physiology can be a little bit confusing, is that not all the metabolites will produce the same effect that you think. But the nice thing is that things like hydrogen ions, potassium, lactate, nitric oxide, they're definitely vasodilators. Now, the key word to use here is that there's an increase in cerebral blood flow through what's called flow metabolism coupling. And I think that's a very nice sort of keyword to sort of use in your answer. I think it just explains the control of cerebral blood flow with metabolic rate really, really nicely. Okay, I think there's other terms around, but I think flow metabolism coupling is the one that I would use. Now, the numbers that Miller's has is that the metabolic rate decreases by 6 to 7% for every degree drop, for every degree Celsius drop. Note that's different to Parancam. Parancam has it as 7 to 10%. So look, when that happens, I will probably just use 7% in my answer. All right, and that's the number that I'll remember. So there's a 7% drop for every degree of Celsius drop in your cerebral metabolic rate. And again, I would say there's probably a 1-to-1 relationship between cerebral blood flow and your cerebral metabolic rate. Okay, and you get complete suppression of the EEG at about 18 to 20 degrees. Now, the thing to note is that this relationship is for hypothermia. And when we think about hypothermia, so when the temperature sort of goes up, so initially, yes, there is a substantial increase again in your metabolic rate and therefore your cerebral blood flow. But once you get temperatures above 42 degrees, what happens is that those two start to tail off. So your metabolic rate starts to tail off, and that is thought to be due to the neuronal injury and sort of protein denaturation from just the high temperatures. So, you know, if temperature and CMRO2 with temperature increasing, what you would see is that you would see this graph here, and as it hits sort of 42 degrees, you'd see it come down. Okay. Now, just be aware there's multiple ways to draw the metabolic rate and temperature graphs. So I've seen different ways of doing it, and the reason why it's different is because of how temperature sort of changes on the x-axis. So I've seen graphs where instead of temperature increasing, I've got temperature decreasing here. So, you know, you've got something like 40 degrees, 30 degrees, 20 and 10, and then how that affects your metabolic rate. And so you get a graph like this. All right. So just be aware that you'll see variations of this graph just depending on how temperature is defined on the x-axis. Okay, now the changes to partial pressure of CO2. So the number that Miller's has is that it changes 1 to 2 mils for every 100 grams per minute for every millimeter of mercury of change of CO2 between 20 to 80. And PowerCam has it at 2 to 4%, but they're the same. So remember that cerebral blood flow is 50 mils per 100 grams per minute. So 1 divided by 50 is 2%, and 2 divided by 50 is 4%. Okay. So in other words, if you work it out, it's exactly the same that of what PowerCam has said. So your cerebral blood flow changes by 2 to 4% for every millimeter mercury of change of partial pressure of CO2 between 20 to 80 millimeters of mercury. So again, okay to use those two numbers, whether you want to use mils or whether you want to use it as a percentage, but know that they're represented differently in those two different texts. As hypotension occurs, what you'll see is that this graph starts flatlining. So initially with hypotension, with a 33% reduction, you see this slope come down. And then with a further reduction in hypotension, you see it just sort of shift down and also flatline as well. Quite an interesting graph to actually sort of reproduce. Now, the CO2 changes are via pH, and it's rapid but not sustained. And so the pH returns to normal in 6 to 8 hours. Remember how we talked about the Steele and then the Robin Hood syndrome? And this is talking about what happens afterwards. So what it's saying is that after a prolonged period of hypocapnia, so when you've got hypocapnia, you get vasoconstriction, and then after that, you get reduction in your cerebral blood flow. But this is saying that at 6 to 8 hours, that will start normalizing. And so that if you start returning your CO2 from a hypocapnic state to a normal PaCO2, what actually happens is that there becomes a relative hypercapnia. And that will lead to a rise in your cerebral blood flow and possibly to your intracranial pressure, depending on what the current state of your compliance is. And that lasts for another 8 hours before the pH normalizes again. So Miller's is describing what happens after that 6 to 8 hours, whereas PowerCam is describing what happens within that sort of 6 to 8 hours. Okay. And this is the graph that Miller sort of describes, where when you start hyperventilating and dropping your PaCO2, so you become hypocapnic, your CSF pH increases and your cerebral blood flow initially decreases due to vasoconstriction. But as you can see, after sort of 8 hours, it starts normalizing again. And then the risk is that if you start correcting your PaCO2 back to normal, what will happen is that your CSF pH, which has normalized, will start becoming acidotic, and then you start seeing your cerebral blood flow rise before it starts correcting again. But it's that rise at this point here, which may be detrimental, if the compliance of the cranium is at its sort of peak already. Okay. Now, with the effect of partial pressure of oxygen, so you see that cerebral blood flow increases when it's less than 60 millimeters of mercury. And the mechanism of that is through deoxyhemoglobin mediating release of nitric oxide. The other mechanism is that there's hypoxia-induced hyperpolarization of smooth muscle, and that there's stimulation of the rostral-ventral-lateral medulla. This explanation is a lot more detailed than the one that PowerCam produced. So PowerCam alluded to that that the PaO2 was caused by lactic acidosis, but this mechanism is different. Okay, so this mechanism states that deoxyhemoglobin is releasing nitric oxide, you get hypoxia-induced hyperpolarization of smooth muscle, and you get stimulation of the medulla to actually cause vasodilation. Now, the interesting point about this is that cerebral blood flow can also increase due to reduced oxygen content from anemia. but the response is not as strong. And I think I've got a graph to show this to you next. So this is the graph here. And we know that when we think about oxygen content, so oxygen content in blood equals your saturations times your hemoglobin times 1.36 plus the partial pressure of oxygen times, and that's in grams per deciliter, 0.003. And that's your solubility coefficient. And what it's saying is that there's two things that can cause a reduction in content in your oxygen blood. So one is that you're hypoxemic, in other words, the partial pressure drops. Or two is that you are anemic, okay? And what this graph shows here, so for a percentage change in your content of oxygen, if it's due to hypoxemic hypoxia, so if it's due to a reduction in your PaO2, you can see that the change in your cerebral blood flow is a lot more than if the reduction in the content of oxygen is due to anemia. Let's say you've got an oxygen content that is 40% reduced or 50% reduced. So this line here, if it's due to hypoxemia, you can actually see that the brain does really well in increasing cerebral blood flow so that the delivery of oxygen pretty much stays the same. But when it's due to anemia, your cerebral blood flow will increase, but not to the same extent as if you had it from hypoxemia. All right. This next one here talks about myogenic autoregulation. And that is, and I put the formula here that cerebral blood flow equals your perfusion pressure divided by your vascular resistance. And that cerebral blood flow is autoregulated between a MAP of 70 to 150 millimeters of mercury by modifying the vascular resistance. What is interesting here, or what Miller talks about in this chapter also, is that the reason why we use mean arterial pressure instead of cerebral perfusion pressure, because if you think about this, if you look at the formula above, cerebral perfusion pressure is actually the ideal independent variable. But the reason why we use MAP instead of cerebral perfusion pressure is that we don't routinely measure intracranial pressure. And so we make the inference that there's a direct relationship between CPP and MAP, okay, through this formula here. Okay, where your cerebral perfusion pressure equals your MAP minus your ICP. And remember all those different values of ICP, but it's around 10 millimeters of mercury. Now, they've said that the mechanism is unknown, but they said, unlike power and cam, that nitric oxide and calcium channels may be involved during hypotension. So again, a little contradictory statement here, but the one that they can agree on is that the mechanism is at this point undetermined. Okay. This is what the graph looks like, and I've also got the graph of how CO2 changes this graph. So the thing to note here is that in the presence of hypercapnia, you see a shift up, and hypocapnia, you see a shift down. Okay, and then what you also need to know, we'll mention it in the next couple of slides, but I think it's just important to draw it here, is that what shifts it to the right and what shifts it to the left. So what shifts to the right is prolonged sympathetic stimulation. Okay, and then what shifts it to the left here is probably something like in neonates, where your blood pressure is just functions on that lower side of things. All right. Now, the third thing that Miller's talks about is rheology. And we don't need to spend too much time on this. In other words, it will just be like a short little section in our answer. And again, it's related to the formula, cerebral blood flow equals your perfusion pressure divided by your resistance. And the key concept is that a low hematocrit decreases your resistance and therefore should theoretically increase your cerebral blood flow. Where this is important is that when you have cerebral ischemia and vasodilation secondary to the ischemia is already maximal. And remember that it's impaired in these patients who have ischemia. So when they've got vasodilation and it's at its maximal, a hematocrit of 30 to 34% results in optimal oxygen delivery. And this was a very sort of nice sort of study done. So hematocrit normally sits around sort of 40 to 50% in most normal individuals. So reducing it to 30 to 34% in someone with cerebral ischemia has been shown to optimize oxygen delivery, but no clinical benefit has been shown. Now, finally, neurogenic. So we sort of mentioned it 2 slides before. The sympathetic stimulation will shift the myogenic curve to the right. The other benefit of sympathetic stimulation, which is postulated, is that with the vasoconstriction that you get beyond the upper limits of autoregulation, minimize the further increases in cerebral blood flow, and it's thought to be protective. And then when you think about it conversely, you also want to reduce the vasodilatation during hypotension. And then finally, this is a very, very nice graph from Miller's. And what the authors actually want to bring up is just that contemporary view of what cerebral autoregulation is. In other words, it's not just myogenic autoregulation. It actually encompasses all of this, okay? So this is the conventional view. The conventional view of cerebral autoregulation is that CBF is maintained constant with a variation in MAP. But what it's saying now is that a more contemporary view is that it actually encompasses all of this. And I say that to you because this is why it's confusing, because a lot of texts, when they talk about autoregulation, are just meaning the myogenic response, whereas I think for most of us, they actually mean everything. So they mean not just the myogenic response, but the chemical response, which is includes metabolic, PaCO2, PaO2, and also the neurogenic control as well. I've highlighted this little bit here, which has to do with cardiac output. Okay, so Miller's actually has a 5th component to cerebral autoregulation, and that's to do with cardiac output. And their reasoning is that this is important because the capacity of all those other mechanisms that we talked about is really dependent on adequate cardiac output to be able to maintain your cerebral blood flow in response to hypotension. So this would be the last thing that I would sort of add on to my answer. So we'd have all those, I would have chemical, which would include these 3. I would have the myogenic response. I would have neurogenic control. I would have rheology, which is not here. And then the 5th thing that I would have is cardiac output. Finally, I bring up this graph because this is a really interesting graph, and this will allow you to sort of understand the relationship between cerebral blood flow and cerebral blood volume. Remember that we talk about cerebral blood volume when we're talking about intracranial pressure, and the way that cerebral blood volume is increased is through an increase in your cerebral blood flow, but it's not a one-to-one relationship. So the relationship is that it's a 2 to 5. So what that means is that when there's a 50% increase in your cerebral blood flow, the change in your cerebral blood volume is only about 20%. Okay. This is going to be my structure for this answer here. So I'm going to have normal values for cerebral blood flow. I'm going to talk about the importance of consistency of supply. And then after that, I'm going to have a structure where I've got the factors affecting the cerebral blood flow, which I'll divide it into chemical, myogenic, rheology, neurogenic, and cardiac output. And I will put metabolic, PCO2 and PO2 under chemical. And from the slides, I know that chemical and myogenic are going to take up a lot more of the answer. So I will probably put rheology, neurogenic, and cardiac output towards the end. I'll probably just leave a page for that, where I'll probably leave, you know, a page and a half to 2 for those 2 concepts there. Okay, you ready, Zach?
Yeah,
all right.
ready to go.
Ready to go. All right. let's go. So I'm going to have my values here. And then after that, I'm going to have the factors affecting cerebral blood flow, which I'll divide into chemical. And I know that after that, I would say half the page here would be myogenic. And then 3 neurogenic, 4 rheology, and 5 cardiac output. And then within the chemical, I'm going to talk about metabolic. I'm going to talk about PCO2. I'm going to talk about PO2. Okay, so my values are cerebral blood flow, or CPF, equals 50 mils per 100 grams per minute and cerebral metabolic O2 consumption equals 3.5 mils per 100 grams per minute. It's tightly regulated because of limited storage of substrates and high metabolic rate, and also space constraints by non-compliant cranium. So that avoids a low CDF, that you want to avoid high cerebral blood flow. Okay. And then the things, cerebral blood flow equals your cerebral perfusion pressure, or CPP, divided by cerebral vascular resistance, CVR. Okay, so with metabolic, I know that neuronal activity increases metabolic rate, increases things like H+, K+, lactate, which then decreases your cerebrovascular resistance and increases your cerebral blood flow. Your cerebral metabolic rate decreases by approximately 7% for every degree Celsius drop. And there is a linear relationship between CMR and cerebral blood flow. Okay, so with PCO2, what I'm going to say is changes cerebral blood flow by 2 to 4% for every millimeter change of PaCO2 between 20 to 80 millimeters of mercury. Rapid, but not sustained. Normalizes after 8 hours, and then the effect reduced by hypertension. And with PO2, CBF increases when PaO2 is less than 60 millimeters of mercury due to nitric oxide, hypoxia-induced hyperpolarization of smooth muscle and stimulation of the medulla. Draw my little diagram here where I have CBF in terms of mils per 100 grams per minute. I've got 50 and 100. I've got millimeters of mercury here. Again, I've got 0 to 100. Important numbers when we think about O2 is 60, so less than 60 it starts increasing. And so we'll say that's PaO2, and then PaCO2 is between 20 to 80. And so what we have here is, and you want it to have normal between sort of 40 to around this area here. Okay, then the myogenic. So this is also called the Baylis effect. Baylis effect. And it's autoregulated between map of 70 to 150 millimeters of mercury by modifying your cerebrovascular resistance. Again, we have a graph here. So 0 to 200, I'll have 70 and 150 here. Again, CBF mils per 100 gram per minute, 50 to 100. So 70 to 50 I have here, like that. Okay, the pen is dying, so grab another pen. So neurogenic, sympathetic stimulation or shift myogenic curve to the right, vasoconstriction, protective beyond upper limits of autoregulation, and then reduces vasodilation during hypotension. With Rheology, a decrease in hematocrit decreases your vascular resistance, increases your cerebral blood flow. So optimal hematocrit of 30 to 30% is 30 when vasodilation secondary to ischemia is maximal. However, no clinical benefit shown. And cardiac output capacity of autoregulatory mechanisms described above is dependent on adequate cardiac output to maintain your cerebral perfusion pressure. Okay, that is done. Stop there. So that's 9 minutes and 26 seconds. You know that table from Miller's and Hemmings and Egan that I have on the slides there? I think that, I think that table is really good. I think that sort of gives you clarity. Like the things you don't actually need to mention cardiac output. If you mention the other things, which is the chemical side, which is includes your metabolic rate, PO2, PCO2, your myogenic autoregulation, which is to do with MAP, and then finally neurogenic and rheology,